In December 1936, King Edward V gave up the British Empire for the woman he loved. The world called it the romance of the century. But behind that story was a letter, and the woman at the center of it was begging him to stop. In letters published from the abdication crisis, Wallis was not celebrating a royal sacrifice. She was urging Edward not to make it. At one point, she wrote that she was anxious for him not to abdicate, and that she wanted him to remain king. That one sentence cracks the legend open. If Edward surrendered the throne for Wallis, why was Wallis trying to stop him? Why would a king give up everything for a woman who appears, in her own correspondence, to have been begging him not to? The answer begins where the myth breaks, in the gap between the public story and the private record. That gap matters because both easy versions fail almost immediately. Wallis Simpson was not a storybook temptress who single-handedly brought down a king, and she was not a spotless victim with no agency. She was a twice-married American woman moving through a British royal system that had almost no room for someone like her, while Edward turned a private attachment into a public crisis. So the trail starts close to the moment itself. Wallis's published letters, Edward's correspondence, the official abdication record, and the 1936 timeline as the pressure closed in. Later biographies and archival files help as context for what people around them believed, feared, and recorded, not as permission to invent motives. Edward did abdicate. The harder question is what that act did to the woman he claimed to be saving, especially when her own words show her trying to prevent it. That question only makes sense if the throne was never just Edward's to spend. Go back to January 1936, when he inherited it. It was not his private possession. It was a public office, wrapped in church, government, empire, and duty. When George V died in January 1936, Edward inherited more than palaces, uniforms, and a crown. He inherited a system that watched every private choice. He became the visible center of a constitutional machine. King, Parliament, Prime Minister, Church, Empire, and dominions, all tied to the idea that the monarch did not simply do what he wanted. To many ordinary people, Edward seemed modern and magnetic. As Prince of Wales, he had toured factories, mining towns, hospitals, and imperial outposts with an ease that made him look less remote than earlier royal men. He understood the camera, and the camera liked him. Inside government and palace circles, though, that charm did not erase worries about his discipline, judgment, and willingness to accept limits. The king was expected to embody restraint. He was supreme governor of the Church of England, in a country where the church did not then permit the remarriage of divorced people whose former spouses were still living. He also reigned through elected ministers, so his marriage was not just a family matter. It had to be acceptable to the government and politically survivable across Britain and the wider empire. Wallis Simpson collided with every pressure point in that system. She was American, socially sophisticated, still married when her relationship with Edward deepened, and in the process of becoming twice divorced. None of that proves the caricature of a schemer. In 1936, it made her nearly impossible as a future queen. The danger was not simply that Edward loved the wrong woman, it was that he seemed ready to bend a public office around a private desire. Once that became visible, the next fight was over information. Who could see the crisis, who could print it, and how long the British silence could hold. For much of 1936, many British newspapers held back from openly reporting what foreign papers were already treating as a scandal. Readers in America and parts of Europe could see the king's attachment to Wallis Simpson discussed directly, while in Britain it moved through whispers, society columns, and private warnings rather than blunt front-page confrontation. The silence bought time. It did not solve the constitutional problem. Inside government, the problem was becoming impossible to contain. Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson was moving forward, and Edward's intention to marry her was no longer abstract. If he married her as king, could a twice-divorced American woman with living former husbands be accepted as queen beside the supreme governor of the Church of England? Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and the cabinet did not think so. A king's marriage had to survive Parliament, the Dominions, the Church, and public confidence in the crown. Edward explored alternatives, including a marriage in which Wallis would not become queen. The government rejected that path too. By then, pressure was coming from every direction at once. What had begun as a private relationship became a constitutional test, and Wallis became its visible human symbol. She was not directing the cabinet or controlling the press, yet the crisis increasingly took on her face. By early December, the British silence broke. Government, newspapers, churches, and palace officials converged on the same crisis. For Wallis, every option narrowed: stay and be blamed for the king's defiance, leave and risk Edward turning that departure into a catastrophe of his own making. Then the noise drops away. Behind the headlines, the letters show Wallis sounding far less triumphant. The temperature changes when the story becomes handwriting. The key record is not palace gossip passed through a drawing room. It is published correspondence, including letters later edited by Michael Block in Wallis and Edward, letters 1931 to 1937. These letters do not let us read every private feeling she ever had. They show something narrower and more powerful. What Wallis was saying while the crisis closed around her. In late 1936, as Edward pressed toward abdication, Wallis was not writing like a woman calmly accepting a crownless king as a romantic prize. She was urging him not to do it. In one of the starkest lines associated with this period, she tells him she is anxious for him not to abdicate and that she wants him to remain king. That sentence cuts across the legend. The public version imagines a woman receiving the greatest sacrifice a man could offer. The letters show a woman trying to stop the sacrifice before it became irreversible. Her actions moved the same way. As pressure intensified in Britain, Wallis left for the south of France, away from London, while the crisis reached its peak. On a map, it is simple: London to the Riviera. In the timeline, it looks like distance used as strategy. If her presence had become the visible obstacle, removing herself was one of the few moves left. There was also discussion of a public statement in which Wallis would withdraw from the relationship, offering herself as the thing to be removed so Edward could keep the throne. That did not become the ending. Edward did not accept distance as a solution. These letters do not prove Wallis never loved him. They do not make her helpless or solve every contradiction in her character, but they do prove the abdication was not simply a gift she reached out to take. At the moment, history would later cast her as the woman who made a king abandon duty. Wallis was privately trying to create a way for him to remain exactly where he was. So Wallis pulled away. Why did the distance fail? Distance only worked if Edward accepted what it meant. According to biographers who have studied the relationship closely, he did not. Here, the romance story darkens. In Wallis's letters, we see her trying to step back. In later biographical accounts, we see the other half of the pressure, Edward treating her withdrawal not as a painful ending, but as something he could not survive. Anne Seber, among others, describes Edward's attachment to Wallis as intensely dependent. Accounts from the period describe him making threats of self-harm if she left him, including threats that turn a breakup into an emergency. This has to be handled carefully. We are not watching the scene. We are not diagnosing Edward across a century. We are dealing with biographical interpretation, private correspondence, and reported accounts from people around the crisis. But the reported pattern still matters. If Wallis tried to remove herself, Edward made removal feel catastrophic. If she offered distance, he answered with permanence. If she tried to let him remain king, he turned the choice back onto her, as if his crown, identity, and will to go on were tied to her staying. That is the imbalance hidden inside the famous romance. Edward had the throne, the title, the constitutional power, and the final legal choice. Wallace had reputation, marriage, mobility, and safety to lose. Yet emotionally, he made her responsible for the meaning of his life. So when she left for France, it was not a clean escape. It was a blocked exit. The map line runs away from London, but the pressure travels with it. Once Edward refused to let the private story end, the British state had to turn that private crisis into an official transfer of power. Once Edward refused to let the private story end, the monarchy did what institutions do. It turned personal chaos into procedure. On December 10, 1936, Edward signed the Instrument of Abdication. The document was legal, cold, and final. Edward putting his name to the end of his own reign, with his brothers witnessing the act that moved the crown away from him. The next day, the private crisis became a radio broadcast across the empire. Edward spoke by radio and gave the sentence that would define him. He could not carry the heavy burden of kingship without the help and support of the woman he loved. For millions listening, that line turned constitutional collapse into a love story. It gave the public a simple shape. The king had chosen a woman over a throne, but simplicity has a cost. Edward became the tragic lover, and Wallace became the woman for whom everything had been lost. The crown did not disappear, it moved sideways. Edward's younger brother, Albert, became King George VI. He was not raised for that role in the way Edward had been, and the accession brought strain onto a man, a marriage, and 2 young daughters. One of those daughters was Princess Elizabeth. Because Edward left no legitimate children and stepped away from the throne, the line that would have passed through him now ran through George VI and then to Elizabeth II. The abdication did more than end one reign. It reshaped the royal future. For the monarchy, survival required a new story. Duty had been restored, order had returned, the crown had passed to a steadier household. For Wallace, the story hardened in the opposite direction. She was treated by much of the public imagination as the woman who took a king from his people, even though her letters show her urging him not to go. Edward signed the decision that changed the line of succession. The institution recovered by presenting his departure as a moral wound it had endured. Wallace, who had tried to stop the sacrifice, became the face of the sacrifice itself. After that, there was no place for them inside the palace system. Edward and Wallace were left outside the gates, carrying the myth that had made his abdication bearable to everyone but them. At first, exile did not look like punishment. Edward was no longer king, but he was made Duke of Windsor. Wallace, after their marriage in 1937, became Duchess of Windsor. They had titles, money, invitations, clothes, houses, and photographs taken in flattering light. From a distance, exile could be mistaken for elegance. But one missing piece mattered enormously. Wallace was not allowed to use the style Her Royal Highness. For Edward, this was not a small point of etiquette. It was a permanent reminder that his family had accepted his rank while withholding full recognition from his wife. Every formal introduction carried the wound. Their life moved largely outside Britain, especially in France, where the route that once looked like escape became a boundary. Paris drawing rooms, rented villas, arranged dinners, and public appearances replaced the world Edward had been born to inhabit. He had given up the machinery of kingship, but not the habits of being treated as royal. Wallace had to stand beside him, inside the only story that made sense of it all. The world expected proof that the sacrifice had been worth it. Every smile, posed photograph, and polished appearance helped keep the romance alive, because without that romance, Edward's abdication looked less like destiny and more like ruin. The love story became their occupation. Their reputation also grew more complicated. Their 1937 visit to Germany and later intelligence concerns about the Duke and Duchess added a darker shadow to how governments watched them and how the public judged them. That history matters, but it does not replace the central trap. It made exile colder, more scrutinized, and harder to romanticize. In letters and later biographies, Wallis appears less like a woman enjoying a prize than a woman living with the cost of one. Friends saw isolation. Writers describe resentment. The rooms were comfortable. They were not freedom. By then, she could not easily contradict the myth without destroying the only meaning Edward had left. He had lost the crown for her, so she had to keep being the woman for whom it had all been worth losing. That was the golden prison, not simply France, banishment, or the missing letters before her name, but a lifetime spent performing a romance she had once tried to stop. By the end, the old headline has lost its innocence. One part of the story is fact. Edward VIII abdicated. He signed away the throne, spoke to the empire by radio, and chose a life outside the monarchy he had been born to inherit. Another part is evidence. In her private correspondence, Wallis Simpson was not simply accepting a royal sacrifice, she was urging him not to make it. She wanted him to remain king. She tried, at moments, to remove herself from the crisis. The final part is interpretation, and it has to be held carefully. This was not a fairy tale with a hidden villain. Wallis was ambitious, flawed, socially skilled, and often difficult to read. Edward was not simply a romantic martyr. He was a man whose need for her became inseparable from his need to define himself against the institution around him. But the myth needed one clean sentence. The public got one. He gave up the throne for love. That sentence protected Edward from looking reckless. It helped the monarchy turn disaster into a lesson about duty, and it left Wallis carrying the shape of the blame. The tragedy is not only that Edward lost a crown, it is that the crown changed form. For him, it became the proof of devotion. For her, it became the story she had to live inside. A crown on an empty table, a letter beside it, a palace gate closed. He gave up the throne. She inherited the cage.